Hello, this audio slideshow is designed for IB history students. You can use it if you're studying Mustafa Kemal for paper 3 for the Africa and Middle East paper, or also if you're using Ataturk as one of the authoritarian leaders for paper 2. This slideshow is about the rise to power of Ataturk in Turkey. On this slide you can see there the main things that we're going to cover, looking at the end of the First World War for the Ottoman Empire and the kind of final stages and the conditions in which Mustafa Kemal comes to power. I've set up the video so that there's opportunities for some questions for you to think about what you know, press pause, and then I'll go through the answers and the ideas with you. So first of all, you need to be sure that you're clear on what life was like in the Ottoman Empire during World War I. So there's two questions to think about really, and war is a key element in shaping the rise to power of authoritarian leaders, and of course it utterly shapes the circumstances in Turkey as Mustafa Kemal rises to power. So think about why the Ottoman Empire got involved in World War I and what the war was like for them, and then second of all, by October 1918, why they're asking for peace. So press pause now and have a go at thinking about those two questions. So, of course, during the war, the main things to understand is that flurry of Allied diplomacy, not really based towards Turkey, but of course anticipating the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. If you're studying other elements of the Middle East, this unit, and of course you would be if you're doing the higher level course, you'll be aware of the Allied wartime diplomacy. It's mostly set around Britain, also with engagement from France as well. So you should know that the Hussein McMahon correspondence of 1915 and 1916 give an indication that Britain would support some type of Arab independence in the former Ottoman Empire territories in return for an Arab revolt. And that promise is not kept, of course, and the British take on the mandates. But there's an idea there encouraging the Hashemites, Sharif Hussein of Mecca, to organise that Arab revolt. By 1916, Britain is also intriguing with the French in the Sykes-Picot Agreement, those famous lines in the sand that were drawn over 1916. That secret agreement is revealed and discredited after the war as the Russians, as the Bolsheviks head into the Russian Imperial Archives and reveal that shoddy agreement to the rest of the world. By November 1917, Balfour Declaration has also taken place with that promise of a national Jewish homeland in Palestine, and that was that wording of all of these documents and the kind of different loose commitments and assumptions made will obviously go on to cause a lot of trouble for the region in the years to come. Also, it's worth noting the Treaty of London in 1915, which in Italy joins the Allied side during the war. The Italians are promised the Dalmatian coastline as well as Smyrna or Izmir today, which is on the west coast of sort of mainland Turkey, as well as areas of eastern Anatolia. And Lord Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, also promises eastern Anatolia to the Greeks at that same time. So some confusion there and sort of some double commitment promises. The Ottomans are incredibly strained at the end of the war, and really with a third of their soldiers injured, killed, and hundreds of POWs deserted, and an absolute economic devastation. Economy was ruined. They sue for peace, and that comes to head at the Armistice of Mudros in October 1918. So you need to be clear on the real devastation that Turkey faces at the end of the war, and of course the numbers of civilians being killed as well as Ottoman Empire soldiers. At Mudros then, the armistice is signed, and again take a moment here and press pause and think about what the consequences were for Turkey. So as a result of the Armistice of Mudros, things happen very quickly, and a number of historians, including Stephen Kinzer, will argue that Turkey is treated far more harshly than the other powers that it was engaged with in the war, Germany, Austria-Hungary. The Armistice of Mudros ends the Ottoman Empire's war with the Allies, and the Sultan dissolves the Turkish parliament. He's hoping to get a new government together of men that are willing to accept the Allied terms. Pretty swiftly, Turkey is occupied. An Allied administration is set up in Istanbul. France will occupy the southeast coast of Turkey near Syria. Britain will take control of the Dardanelles, the Gallipoli region, with that all-important access to the Black Sea, and Italy will land at Anatolia on the southwest coast of Anatolia. In the meantime, though, something else is happening, and Mustafa Kemal is actually sent to Samsun, which is a city on the north of Anatolia, on the south of the Black Sea coast, and he's actually sent there first of all to try and kind of quell nationalist uprisings that are happening against the armistice of Mudros. But when he gets there, he actually kind of organises a new army and begins to travel across Turkey, getting support and getting organised. Kemal was a well-respected soldier at this time. He'd performed heroically, and he'd also seen a little bit of action across the Ottoman Empire. He'd served in Damascus, where he'd been disappointed with kind of Ottoman excesses and indulgences, and he'd also been in Libya. So in the meantime, though, the Greeks have arrived in Turkey, and they are occupying in Smyrna, which today is Izmir, and even though the Sultan had ordered Turkish troops not to resist the Greeks, Mustafa Kemal is working his way across Turkey, resisting foreign occupation, and so on. One of the things that happens is the Greeks are pushed into service a little bit by the British because they want to try and manage this collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And of course, the Greeks are happy to go along with this, hoping that they will be able to secure their hold of Western Turkey. So while all of this is going on, then the situation is getting more and more grave for the Sultan. And there's just some notes there for you that I've just sort of kind of talked through. So as Mustafa Kemal is working his way westwards, kind of gathering national support while he's going, and also fighting the Greeks and other foreigners who are coming into Turkey to try and get a sort of piece of the action, Armenians, also Italians, the Treaty of Sèvres is signed in August 1920. Again, press pause here and see what you can remember about the Treaty of Sèvres, what the main terms were. So the proposals for Sèvres, as you know, were pretty drastic, and you might have remembered some type of carve-up looking something like this. That possible Kurdish territory is of course discussed and promises made, which still kind of echo and cause challenges to Turkey to this day. You can see that large parts of Turkey were intended to be handed over to Greece, France, Italy and Armenia. The area around that Dardanelles area, that all-important access to the Black Sea, would be controlled by an international force. There would be an international financial control to control the Turkish economy, and the areas of the former Ottoman Empire, the countries Palestine, Lebanon, Transjordan, Syria and Iraq, will all become mandates of Britain and France, and that would kind of the public version, as it were, of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And really, Graham Ross, in his book, The Great Powers, 1914 to 1945, talks about how this mandate system is going to give like a spurious respectability to British and French ambitions in the Middle East. But really, it is empire building and colonialism by another name. So the Treaty of Sèvres would have absolutely devastated Turkey and Turkish nationalism. And it's really at this point that things are now galvanizing into the Turkish War of Independence. Again, there's a few questions here for you to have a look at and think about, and those ideas should help you. So press pause for a moment and see if you can work your way through these questions. So of course, for number one, it's the Sultan's government in Istanbul, and by now Mustafa Kemal has organised the Grand National Assembly, the first of his parliament-type organisations in Ankara. The key conflict that makes up the Turkish War of Independence is the Greco-Turkish War, and that's fought between 1920 and 1922. As I said earlier, the Greeks had claimed Western Anatolia and landed in Izmir, so now the former subjects of the Ottoman Empire are landing there as conquerors, and really the Turks are absolutely roused to fight. They've got nothing left to lose at this point, with Sèvres on the table with this harsh carve up, and it's a sort of galvanization of Turkish national opinion, and the kind of the sort of vigor of the Turks really do sort of slam back the Greeks. The Sultan is now absolutely discredited. He's an allied puppet who's gone along with the carve up of Turkey, and the Greeks will retreat fairly rapidly, and the Turks were resisting in both Armenian and Greek kind of claims. And by September 1922, Mustafa Kemal's troops have occupied Izmir, and then they drive the Greeks out of the rest of Turkey, crossing the Dardanelles. So at this point, Mustafa Kemal is absolutely in the ascendancy. And it's the Ankara delegation, these representatives of Mustafa Kemal, that actually are the ones that go to Lausanne. Now, the Lausanne is called by the Allies. They're the ones that want it to happen, and they're looking for the settlement to be reached. So the Ankara delegation trots off to Lausanne to deal with the business of this Turkish War of Independence. So it establishes for us a number of precedents. First of all, it shows us that the Versailles treaties can be overthrown. They can be overthrown through conflict. And second of all, it's a tacit recognition now of the legitimacy of Mustafa Kemal as a leader of Turkey. So that's the end of the terms. And of course, Lausanne itself will provide a much better state of affairs for the Turks at the end of the First World War. They get full sovereignty over what is today basically the Turkish Republic, and Armenian and Kurdish aspirations are crushed as Anatolia is protected as the Turkish heartland. The Arab lands remain in the hands of the British and French, and Turkey would now control the Dardanelles. That idea of an international waterway has gone. So Lausanne really flips over and overturns the demands of Sèvres, and Lausanne is the treaty that establishes Mustafa Kemal in Ankara as the leader of the Turks and overturns the harsh terms of the Treaty of Sèvres. In the meantime, though, a war of minorities and a racial war has been going on, and it really is kind of typified by the population exchange of 1923. The Greeks were not the only ones to leave, but they're a main focus and case study for the IB. So press pause now and have a think about these two questions. So it may seem particularly brutal today, but it actually was proposed and approved of by Fridtjof Nansen, who was one of the inventors of the Nansen passport and was famous for dealing with the refugee crisis all across Europe that followed the First World War. So it might seem to us to be very inhumane, and it certainly was, but at the time it was accepted as a way of solving the ethnic challenges and rivalries that had existed in Turkey. About 1 million Greeks left Turkey, and probably about 300,000 Turks came from Greece to Turkey. The main way they were defined was by religion, so you could be a third or fourth generation Greek living in Turkey, speaking Turkish, but it was your Christian faith that would define you as Greek, and that was really the beginning now of this cultural homogeneity of Turkey. In terms of the demographic and economic consequences, many of the Greeks and Armenian Christians who leave Turkey as a result of these population exchanges were the merchants, were the entrepreneurs and the business people. And that will cause Turkey perhaps not to thrive as it might have done in the mid-1920s as Mustafa Kemal is putting his sort of economic reforms and ambitions together. Finally for you here, there's some exam practice to consider. If you have a look at that little top aspect, that's lifted straight from the IB spec. So that might give you some ideas of the types of questions that you might want to have a look at. Impact of war is clearly huge for Mustafa Kemal to come to power, but of course there are economic problems associated with the war. Turkey, of course, becomes less diverse as time goes on, so perhaps social divisions is something that might be an interesting counter-argument for you to develop, and of course the challenges that the Sultan had been under since the early part of the 20th century. Anyway, I hope the video is helpful to you. Thanks for watching. Bye!